All right, can you, oh, okay, you can hear me. Let's see here. I don't have access to, well, I guess I can see it. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Thanks for the introduction. I would also like to thank Kathy McCarty for scheduling this. I was originally going to give this talk back in November, but I caught a mild case of COVID the weekend before. So thank you, Kathy, for helping to reschedule it. And before I maybe bore you all or put you to sleep, I just want to point out that there are 3 more First Tuesday lectures this semester. Dr. Sarah Ettlinger is giving hers on March 1st. Then on April 5th, we have Dr. Martin Quirk. And then Dr. Tim Haddon on May 3rd. So there's 3 more to go. Okay, so the politicization of history, that's probably the only time I have this word in this talk because I can't pronounce it. All right, so our country's growing political polarization has had a very visible impact on practically every aspect of American society. And to a large extent, we've become polarized. We've become tribalized, falling into rival camps. This is reinforced when we scroll through social media or visit sites like YouTube and Google. Algorithms feed us information that creates a confirmation bias. We only see items that reinforce our pre-existing beliefs. And if you need an example that lays outside of history, we could just look at different responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, although teaching history is subjective, the way people remember and commemorate historical events has always had a political component to it. And given our current environment, it's not a surprise that the debate over historical memory has entered public consciousness in such a noticeable, visible way. And this has probably been the case especially since August 2017, when former President Trump defended monuments celebrating the Confederacy, as well as those behind the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. In this talk, we will examine how groups on both sides, both ends of the political spectrum, actively seek to influence how to teach history with the 1619 Project and the 1776 Report. Groups on both sides, though one more than the other, cherry pick a version of the past to fit their own goals. And they often ignore history itself and the work of historians when trying to influence what students should be taught. We're then going to explore the difference between right and left-wing cancel culture before concluding with an attempt to find consensus. How can we make sense of the past? How can we address the complex legacies of historical figures while putting their accomplishments and failures into context? Well, since some of the earliest civilizations, since we've had written languages, rulers have shaped how people remember certain events, often turning historical memory into self-serving propaganda. For example, if we look on the left, in 1275 BCE, the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II brought a public relations team with him into battle when he waged war against the Hittites. Though the Egyptian victory at the Battle of Kadesh was somewhat of a last-minute fluke, the pharaoh's chroniclers attributed his army's success single-handedly to him. Following this, monuments and even a massive library with 10,000 papyrus scrolls celebrated Ramses II as a military mastermind. And if we throw a rock at history, world history, it will hit someone who has done the same. Whether it's the first emperor in China, or Julius Caesar, or Napoleon Bonaparte, and on and on and on. And the US is no exception in this. At the turn of the 20th century, American writers and politicians created American nationalism, an identity distinct and separate from England and Europe. In doing so, they crafted an origin story for the US full of historical myths that identified heroes and sacred places. More interested in the overall message than accuracy, figures like Washington Irving helped to turn Christopher Columbus into a proto-founding father, a lone individual who brought himself up by his bootstraps, who brought European civilization and Christianity to the New World. Or aided by a national holiday, Thanksgiving, generations of school children grow up viewing Plymouth as our country's hometown. And there's tiny Plymouth Rock. During the Jim Crow era, after the scions of the Confederate ruling class reestablished the political, social, and economic control of the white elite, Southern intellectuals invented the lost cause, a pseudo-historical myth that revised the reasons for Southern secession, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. It's one that's so successful and persistent that it's still around today. Well, in August of 2019, with the movement to remove Confederate memorials gaining some public support, and in context of the Trump presidency, the New York Times Magazine released the 1619 Project. It has since been turned into a book. What was initially a compilation of historical essays, poems, and works of fiction included contributions from 33 different writers, including 3 historians. And the 1619 Project was to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of some 20 to 30 slaves in Jamestown, Virginia. In his work, in his introduction to the work, New York Times editor Jake Silverstein wrote that, quote, "The goal of the 1619 Project is to reframe American history by considering what it would mean to regard 1619 as our nation's birth year instead of 1776. Doing so requires us to place the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a country." Consequently, Silverstein claims that his compilation reveals a previously unknown and untold story. That, quote, "While 1776 is taught in our schools and is unanimously celebrated every 4th of July, 1619 is not a year that most Americans know as a notable date." Therefore, his authors have designed the 1619 Project to serve as a K-12 educational tool. Now, within this work, there are several compelling and well-supported essays. One by journalist and writer Jamelle Bouie called Undemocratic Democracy. In this work, Jamelle Bouie highlights the efforts of politicians to limit democracy to wealthy white elites. He begins his story in the late 1700s by tracking how Southern plantation owners prohibited those without property and wealth from participating in state politics. Once they had a monopoly on political power, Southern plantation owners passed laws that defined slavery, laws that they personally benefited from. And so this, to some extent, helps to debunk the notion that we shouldn't judge pre-Civil War slave owners by today's standards since they were living in a time when slavery was legal. It was legal because they made it legal. I mean, you could cut people who had, who owned fewer slaves, who were not as politically dominant, but still, it's the slave-owning class is dominating politics, and they're writing the laws to support slavery. And this continues after independence. Right? At the Constitutional Convention, 25 of the 55 delegates own slaves, and therefore they have a vested interest in enshrining slavery in federal law. Bouie continues that later in the 1800s, Southern politicians like John C. Calhoun protected slavery in Congress, even calling it a positive good. With the idea that some Americans deserve more rights than others, Bouie links his argument to modern-day voter ID laws. Other essays within the 1619 Project persuasively describe the role that sugar played in the expansion of slavery, the impact of redlining and residential segregation on limiting Black household wealth, the continuation of Jim Crow-era legal oppression in the criminal justice system, as well as Black people's contributions to American music and culture, from jazz to blues to R&B, rock, and pop. Now, while it may seem that the contributors to the 1619 Project are really interested in telling a previously unknown version of history, they are ideologically driven. As Nicole Hannah-Jones, the journalist and creator of the 1619 Project, told the Chicago Tribune, another quote, "If you read the whole project, I don't think you can come away from it without understanding the project is an argument for reparations. You can't read it and not understand that something is owed." End quote. Now, we're not going to debate reparations here. There's certainly a precedent for them in American history. The victims of Japanese internment, the victims of the Tuskegee experiment have received reparations. My critique with the 1619 Project and Hannah Jones and Jake Silverstein is that their case for reparations is weakened by the 1619 Project's inaccurate premise of originality and its many factual errors. Errors that are at best an oversight or at worst intentional to further a political objective. For starters, many of the topics in the 1619 Project's essays have been the subject of historical debate for decades. Placing 1619 as the starting point of US history, or at least a very important date, has been the subject of groundbreaking work since at least the late 1960s. And it's been, at least in some history textbooks, since the 1970s. And it makes sense. As slavery caused the Civil War, backtracking US history to the first time enslaved Africans were brought to British North America, it makes sense. And perhaps I get irked by this idea that it's original here and this story has never been told before, because when I was in college, I learned about it. And in my history classes, I teach 1619. So maybe Silverstein and his collaborators were not paying attention in their history classes. But if the arrival of African slaves is our benchmark for the beginning of the United States, it shouldn't be 1619, it should be 1565 when the Spanish brought African slaves to St. Augustine. Now, while parts of this collection are again quite strong, Nicole Hannah-Jones's opening essay, The Idea of America, contains the most hyperbole and perhaps the worst research. One issue that many historians contest is her contention that Americans really fought for independence due to the British abolitionist movement. Right. This, of course, ignores the anti-slavery sentiment in places like Massachusetts, where the revolution began, and that the British Empire didn't actually end slavery until the 1830s. For proof, Jake Silverstein, one of the editors, cites a proclamation from Virginia's wartime governor, the British governor, who promised slaves freedom in exchange for joining with the British and to fight against the Americans. But what Silverstein fails to note is that the British governor's position was a response to a rebellion that had already begun. Furthermore, Hannah-Jones's claim that Black Americans fought for freedom largely alone overlooks many white allies. It was even in the 1790s that our abolitionist movement began. Pennsylvania's anti-slavery Quakers organized a boycott of goods produced by slave labor. The abolitionist movement that continues into the 1800s included many prominent white people like William Lloyd Garrison, the Grimke sisters, Charles Sumner, and Thaddeus Stevens. Her claims that Black people began the women's suffrage movement and the gay rights movement are also exaggerations. Just like back in 2016, Nancy Eisenberg had a book called White Trash that ignored or underrepresented the contributions of people of color to the US. Hannah-Jones ignores indigenous people completely, but also immigrants, whether Latino, Asian, or European, and the working class in general, in mining America's coal and building her factories and railroads. Another contribution to the 1619 Project is from a Princeton sociologist named Matthew Desmond, and the essay is called Capitalism. His piece highlights how cotton production led to the expansion of slavery at a time when capitalism and the Industrial Revolution were in their infancy. While this essay does not say anything new, because historians, at least since 1944, have linked slavery, cotton, and capitalism, it rests on a distorted idea that all white people benefited from slavery. It's simplistic because although cotton and textiles created an enormous amount of wealth, there were other factories in the North that weren't about textiles. Beyond this, the wealth generated from cotton stagnated and began to decline by the 1830s and 40s. Finally, Desmond fails to note that while capitalism gave rise to slavery, it also plays a role in the anti-slavery movement. Criticized by many as unacceptable today, the abolitionist movement gained a lot of support in the North in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s from people who argued against slavery for economic reasons instead of moral reasons, right? That northern and Midwestern farmers feared competition from slave labor. Now, this may all sound pedantic, but the authors of the 1619 Project did not consult with their historians when trying to influence the future of history education. Details matter when trying to take a moral high ground and argue in favor of a goal as important and contested as reparations. Now, since the original magazine has come out, the authors have revised a few words and phrases when publishing the 1619 Project in book form. But to Silverstein and Hannah Jones, if you're not with them, you're against them. They've accused critical historians of being resentful and insinuated that they're possibly racist. And they lump all backlash with critics on the far right, like Senator Tom Cotton. Now, whatever reservations I have with the 1619 Project, they pale in comparison to the 1776 report. Conceived in 2020 by then President Trump as a direct response to the 1619 Project, the 1776 Commission includes contributions from 18 individuals, mostly lawyers and cable news pundits. And they published their brief, thankfully, brief 41-page report in January 2021. And notably absent in their authors was a specialist in United States history. I bring up the lack of an American history PhD in the 1776 report, not to be an elitist, an academic elitist, but shouldn't a report that is about US history and how we teach US history have a US history specialist on it? I know I was critical of the 1619 Project, but that was a collection of separate essays, most of which were quite good. The 1776 report, however, is a single document. And I should also point out that people who have earned a PhD in a subject are experts in that field. Again, it's a sticking point because we've had administrators here who've made the case that people with PhDs are not experts in their field. Similar people who were saying that philosophy and sociology are not important. Anyway, all right. Spilling, what is it, spilling tea? Yeah. All right. Okay. So those who have a PhD in history, which is the relevant discipline here, are not only well-read, but they've conducted primary source research when they were writing their own research papers or writing their PhD dissertations or publishing peer-reviewed books and articles. In addition to consulting primary sources, professional historians have training in verifying the accuracy of those sources by identifying potential biases and drawbacks. Anecdotes are not strong enough, whether it's something Joe Rogan said or it's something Nicki Minaj heard from a friend in Trinidad. And while I'm on this tangent, scrolling through Facebook and watching videos on YouTube is not conducting research, it's consuming content. Did not expect to get laughs. All right, so let's get into the 1776 report, because it starts off not too bad, right? It's, the first page states that the purpose is to enable a rising generation to understand the history and principles of the founding of the United States in 1776 and to strive to form a more perfect union. The authors even included a remarkably honest sentence in the introduction. Of course, neither America nor any other nation has perfectly lived up to the universal truths of equality, liberty, justice, and government by consent, but no nation before America has ever dared state those truths as a formal basis for its policies. All right, so honest, rational, and admission that the US is not perfect, good. The report's contention that, quote, there was no United States before 1776, as there was not yet formally speaking an American people, is one that, while debatable, is not necessarily wrong. Dates in history are usually arbitrary whether we argue the US began in 1619, 1776, or somewhere in between. The following sections on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are a little bland, like something you would probably read in a 1950s elementary school social studies book. Yes, all men are created equal, the separation of powers, freedom of religion, individual rights. These are all important, but there's no context for the reader. Right? The authors did not mention that these ideas originated outside of the United States, nor did they explain the disagreements the founding fathers had when talking about these ideas. With photos of Martin Luther King Jr. and Frederick Douglass, it may make it easy for some readers to ignore that apart from the opening sentences, there's no recognition that these values were not applied to large segments of the US population. Right? They weren't even applied to impoverished white people. There's absolutely no mention of indigenous people. And on the brief discussion of slavery, the authors dodged the notion that many of our founding fathers were hypocrites as they owned slaves yet fought a war for the concept of freedom. Instead, the authors really make great efforts to portray Washington, Jefferson, and James Madison as anti-slavery leaders. And they must not have thought about the 1,000+ people these three men owned. Perhaps the most audacious spin on US history, and it's hard because there's so many, is to credit these aforementioned slave-owning founders with setting the stage for the abolitionist movement. Well, as our 1776 report takes us to the 20th century, it only gets more mind-boggling. For instance, the authors include a profound misreading of the progressive era. It's difficult to understand what they're trying to get at. They're probably linking the time period called the progressive era with modern-day progressives. But the authors, they include the progressive era in a time period, the progressive era in a section called Challenges to American Principles, alongside topics like slavery, fascism, communism, and identity politics. Right, so the progressive era is right up there with slavery, fascism, communism, and identity politics. I would imagine they're probably upset with the government regulation that came about during this time period, but they don't really even say that. And just, a quick recap, the progressive era was this early 20th century movement that saw support from a broad cross-section of American society. Conservatives and liberals. One of the key champions was a Republican president, Teddy Roosevelt. We got people from the cities, from the countryside, white people, white leaders, black leaders. And so the progressive era saw coalitions of people work together to curb the powers of monopolies, to institute child labor laws, to create safety regulations like sprinkler systems and fire escapes, to implement food and drug regulations, to start national parks, and to give women the right to vote. Moving forward, although the authors of this report acknowledge that both fascism and communism led to totalitarian dictatorships, they falsely call these two movements ideological cousins. They overlook that fascism was a far-right nationalist movement, or even to indicate that fascists and communists were ideological enemies at opposite ends of the political spectrum. And in this section, they compare progressives, and it's unclear if it's modern-day progressives or the progressive era, but they compare them to Mussolini, which, again, is not right. They're on different sides of the political spectrum. Comparing progressives to maybe like Lenin would still be wrong, but that would kind of make sense. So if the contributors to the 1619 project didn't remember content from their history classes, the people who wrote the 1776 report never took a history class. Right? So it's no surprise that because of just the glaring inaccuracies, the American Historical Association and dozens of other historical groups have condemned the 1776 report. Now, the 1776 report calls for a restoration of American education that is accurate, honest, satisfying, inspiring, and ennobling. And that was a quote. Before concluding that, quote, "We must resolve to teach generations of Americans an accurate history of our country so that we all learn and cherish our founding principles once again." Its authors warn of, quote, "movements that reject the fundamental truths of the Declaration of Independence and seek to destroy our constitutional order." They go on to advise the reader that, quote, it is the sacred duty of every generation of American patriots to defend this precious inheritance." So there's a lot of warnings here. It's our duty to uphold, the truths of the Declaration of Independence. But because the author spent more time on the horrors of identity politics and critical race theory than on slavery or the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, it's very clear that the 1776 report is ideologically driven. It's a panicked response to the 1619 project that aims to purge education of critical race theory and racial equity policies. The authors want to regulate history education and use it to instill patriotism for a white nationalist version of America. And the goals of the 1776 report helps us segue into a right-wing version of cancel culture. Right? Anecdotally, from speaking with family friends, there does seem to be a genuine concern that critical race theory will divide our country. Right? A country that's already very divided. That it blames racism and injustice on the United States itself. So among people you talk to, there does seem to be a genuine concern, but it seems like this concern is probably exacerbated, if not invented, by the right wing as an overblown talking point. And it's a talking point that influences elections. Right? It's already been successful in the 2021 Virginia gubernatorial race. Right? But if students learn about mistakes or atrocities committed by white people in the past, at a time when white people were 90% of the population, will that make white students feel ashamed about their culture? If non-white students learn about atrocities committed by white people, will that make them hate the United States? It's hard to say. The country is more diverse, right? And this growing diversity might be a factor in some of the pushback. In the 2020 census, the white population is below 58%. But with a more diverse population, won't learning about the histories and contributions of people of color, won't that, who can that really hurt? But maybe fears and concerns are valid that these subjects will convince some people not to stand for the national anthem or recite the Pledge of Allegiance. But now I feel like I'm a philosopher almost, but is the goal of studying history to make you feel good about yourself? What about the old cliche that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it? And of course, isn't the US a free country? So what good are individual rights if you're forcing people to be patriotic? So at any rate, the concern that critical race theory and learning about past tragedies will create disunity and weaken the social fabric, this is not a new issue. While the authors of the 1776 report view educators and academics as un-American, imperialists made this case at the turn of the 20th century when trying to undermine people like Mark Twain, who opposed American overseas expansion in the Philippines. Accusations of communist sympathy, also present in the 1776 report, were made against liberals, union leaders, and Hollywood during the Red Scare of the 50s, as well as against critics of the Vietnam War. And the Hollywood blacklist of the 1950s can be an early form of cancel culture. By the 1980s and 1990s, Reagan administration officials and commenters like Rush Limbaugh and Charles Krauthammer complained that US history was being overtaken by politically correct agitators who were too interested in multiculturalism. Right? So in the 80s and 90s, it was being politically correct. Present day, it's critical race theory. Now, I had never heard of critical race theory until 2020, and I'm not sure if my teaching style kind of fits in with its definition. You know, whether it does or doesn't, I'm not going to change anything. But I will say in my 15 plus years of teaching, I've never been invited to the meeting where educators plot to make white students feel uncomfortable about their heritage. So it is kind of, there is a concern. We are living in a divided country, but I feel like there's a lot of manipulation going on behind the scenes. And so there's more right-wing cancel culture, and it usually, whether it's planned or not, the right wing they're smart. I feel like they're more clever than the left wing in many ways, right? Their version of cancel culture takes place in a less flashy, subversive manner, banning books, transforming the curriculum, and threatening educators' free speech. For instance, to ensure that some southern state departments of education buy their textbooks, publishers have altered their content. On the right, this is a famous example. In 2014, McGraw-Hill, in one of their history, actually I think it's a geography textbook, they stopped using the word slave. Right, so that the people who were kidnapped from Africa, who were forced into a lifetime of slave labor, hereditary manual labor, they were instead called workers who migrated to the US. And after the backlash, the publisher apologized and agreed to edit the language, but by then more than 100,000 textbooks had already been sold in Texas alone. A more recent US history textbook from Hodder Education to the left questioned to what extent abuse towards Native Americans had been exaggerated. And you've probably heard of banned books a lot in the past couple months. These are just two that relate to history. But through legislation and executive orders, several states like Virginia, Mississippi, Florida, and Oklahoma have banned critical race theory as a teaching method. As part of this, school boards in Tennessee have banned a book about Ruby Bridges on the right. In 1960, as a 6-year-old, she was the first black student to integrate an all-white elementary school in New Orleans. And last week, again in Tennessee, a school board removed the Holocaust graphic novel Maus from its curriculum. Meanwhile, in Texas, as part of their state law banning critical race theory, the legislature directs educators to teach opposing views on the Holocaust. In Arizona, the state legislature made it illegal to teach Latino studies in a state where Latinos make up 32% of the population. And in at least 4 states, it's also illegal to teach LGBTQ history. Now, intimidating educators is another form of right-wing cancel culture. Last week, for example, the newly elected Virginia governor, Glenn Youngkin, set up an email tip line so that parents can report teachers in schools who teach inherently divisive concepts. There are also a number of blogs and websites that seek to identify and fire college professors who they accuse of having a liberal bias. For example, one of my friends who teaches at a public university in Florida, I'm not going to give her name because she doesn't have tenure, but in the spring of 2021, one such fringe blog targeted a Florida professor who planned to teach a class that she called The History of Karen, Weaponizing White Womanhood. This class, The History of Karen, was offered as an elective through the Women's Studies department, as well as through the History department. It was an elective class. No one was required to take it. It was an elective class. It was a 40-seat class, and it filled to maximum capacity within an hour of opening. Right? So it's a class that students wanted to take. And again, it was an elective. Of the handful of professors here will know that, to get a class to fill in an hour is pretty remarkable. But fringe blogs latched onto the class. They accused the instructor of being racist towards white women. The matter then made its way up to Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who is my outside pick to be the next president. Right? So if he can get past Trump in the primary, I think he's going to win. I'm not saying I want him to win, but so we've got these blogs that are really railing against this class. They say it's too offensive and racist towards white women. The matter is brought to attention to Florida's governor. The governor then calls the university's president and demanded the class be removed, and the college president complied. No one involved in canceling the class asked the professor what her course was about or even to look at the syllabus. And for a junior, non-tenured faculty member to have the governor know your name and demand that one of your classes be pulled is a very intimidating experience. Even worse, the professor received and still receives death threats. There was a 2-week period where she was under police protection. Now, whether or not the university was really afraid it might lose its funding, they allowed fringe elements online to cancel a class and violate one of their educators' free speech rights. Now, on the other side, the left wing's version of cancel culture typically includes more public acts, like removing statues, monuments, and renaming schools. Much of this effort has focused on removing monuments that celebrate the military and political leaders of the Confederacy. As this was the topic of my most recent First Tuesday lecture, I won't rehash it all here. You can ask me about it in the Q&A. But my quick recap is: 1, you don't learn history from a statue. Statues and monuments show a community's values. And 2, go ahead and remove them. They not only fought a war in defense of slavery that cost the lives of over 5% of this country's population, they were also traitors. Nevertheless, for many Americans, Trump's 2017 warning, quote, "This week it's Robert E. Lee, and this week Stonewall Jackson. Is George Washington next? Where does it stop?" Trump's warning seems like a very prophetic warning. As more and more Confederate symbols have been removed across the country, monuments to figures now not associated with the Confederacy have also come under fire, enhancing the accusation that the left is trying to erase history. For example, just last year, Chicago officials proposed removing 14 monuments and murals that highlighted cultural insensitivity, including monuments and murals of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant. Also last year, the San Francisco School Board made headlines for its decision to rename 44 schools. Though the decision has since been rescinded, they would have removed the names of figures who they said were linked to historical racism and oppression, like Lincoln, as well as Paul Revere, and even Dianne Feinstein. Dianne Feinstein, she's probably 90. She's a senator. She used to be mayor of San Francisco. And apparently, when she was mayor of San Francisco, at City Hall, they had a bunch of flags that were frayed, and so she had them all replaced, but one of the flags was a Confederate flag. So that was enough to cancel Dianne Feinstein. But that was rescinded because there was a public outcry. The 2 examples I have up here partially concern the depictions of people of color as well as the historical figures. In 2020, on your left, Boston removed a statue of Lincoln, a statue that is based off of a Washington, D.C. statue that is also slated for removal. Now, the original statue that this was based off of was erected in 1876 and was purchased and paid for by ex-slaves and Black Union Army veterans. And although Frederick Douglass spoke at its dedication as well. Though in private, Frederick Douglass did express some concerns about a shirtless black man kneeling before Lincoln. Right. So we have a statue that was actually funded by former slaves as a tribute to Lincoln that is being removed. And then last week at New York's Museum of Natural History, a statue of Teddy Roosevelt was removed, although it's being relocated to North Dakota. So targeting statues of people like Washington, Lincoln, Grant, Teddy Roosevelt may do more harm than good for the left. It exacerbates divisions and feeds into the backlash that helped people like Glenn Youngkin get elected in Virginia. So for this last part of the lecture, let's look at some of these contested figures and provide some historical context on their lives, including shortcomings and achievements. Now, it's not up to me which statues are kept or removed, and again, I'll say we don't learn history from statues anyway. Their choice as to who we honor really reflects our values. But this national debate provides an opportunity to learn about the past. The thing where you're all going to cringe and say it's a teachable moment. I hate when people say that. I just said it. Now, in some of my US history classes, we've held discussions about how should we judge historical figures. And the feedback has been really good. On one hand, students have said we all have faults, or we shouldn't judge people of the past by today's standards, as perspectives on good and bad change rapidly. But then on the other side, there's the attitude that we should hold people of the past accountable today if they weren't held accountable in their lifetime. Or just because something was socially accepted in the past doesn't make it okay. So let's make the case for and against George Washington, right? Commander of the Continental Army, who led American forces against the British in the Revolutionary War, the first president. Now, during the war, he was concerned about the health and well-being of his army. So on February 5th, 1777, he ordered the mass inoculation of his soldiers for smallpox, right? Our first vaccine mandate, right? Important precedent today. Following the war, he resigned from public life, returns to his Virginia plantation. There is this idea, some of you may be familiar with, that Washington could have declared himself a king or become a dictator. Now, towards the end of the Revolutionary War in 1782, Washington corresponded. He wrote to one of his officers, a Colonel Louis Nicola. And this is now called the Nicola Affair, although it's really more myth than reality. The story is, and so in the middle, that's a picture of the letter. The story is that Colonel Nicola offered George Washington a crown and encouraged him to become a king, but Washington refused the offer. Right? So it's not quite true, because if Colonel Nicola had proposed this, on what authority would he have done so? And in reading the letter, it seems like the officer at most is kind of floating an idea. He doesn't directly say Washington should be king, but he says republics are quite weak. Nevertheless, Washington goes home after the war. And in the scope of modern world history, this is a rare act. More often than not, generals who have won wars of independence or have won successful revolutions take power and become dictators. Now, nearly 4 years after the war was over, Washington came out of retirement to chair the Constitutional Convention, and following the Constitution's ratification, he became president. He ran unopposed, although he seems to have been somewhat of a reluctant leader. And he would step down after his second term, which would set a precedent of the two-term president until the 22nd Amendment in 1951. Right, so to some extent, we can congratulate Washington for not becoming a dictator. And it was only in 1788 when Alexander Hamilton, a close confidant confidant of Washington, argued in the Federalist Papers that the presidency should be a lifetime position. The first Vice President, John Adams, also wanted to address the president as His Majesty. Now, aside from his vaccine mandate and steering the country away from dictatorship, the controversial side of Washington is his support for slavery. He would personally own over 100 slaves. During the war, in July 1775, when Washington first became commander of the Continental Army, Washington found, to his surprise, a significant number of black soldiers, perhaps as many as 20%. Washington initially barred the practice of letting black people serve in the Continental Army, though in January of 1777 he changed his mind and approved the enlistment of free black people. But this was perhaps a practical choice. The Army needs soldiers. Following the war, Washington informed some people in private letters, some anti-slavery Quakers, as well as the French officer Marquis de Lafayette, that his views towards slavery were changing. He later went so far as to write that if the legislature approved emancipation, he would support it. So he makes these remarks in private, but he's silent on the issue of slavery in public. And then in addition to this, as a general and later as president, he sought to capture runaway slaves. During the Revolutionary War, when Virginia's governor offered slaves freedom in exchange for joining with the British to fight against the Americans, 18 of Washington's slaves ran away from Mount Vernon. Washington later used slave catchers to recapture 7 of them. As president, when Philadelphia served as the nation's capital, Washington brought slaves from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia. But he would ship them in every 6 months and then ship them out. And so the Washingtons did this to get around Pennsylvania state law, right? Because if the slaves would have stayed in Pennsylvania more than 6 months, they would have had to establish a legal residency there, and therefore they would have had to become free. Also, as president, Washington signed the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, a law passed by Congress that required local governments to help slave owners recapture runaway slaves. The Washingtons took advantage of the Fugitive Slave Act in their efforts to recapture one of their slaves, a woman named Anna Judge. Judge was one of Martha's maids, and in 1796, while in Philadelphia, Anna Judge learned that Martha was planning to give her away as a wedding gift. Spurred by this, Anna Judge fled while the Washingtons ate dinner. With the help of Philadelphia's small free black community, as well as abolitionist Quakers, she was able to escape to New Hampshire. The Washingtons tried several times to recover her, to recapture her, but were ultimately unsuccessful. And this is an advertisement in a New Hampshire newspaper for Anna Judge. Finally, the last thing I'll say about Washington is that in his will, he freed his slaves. So he passes away in December 1799. He frees his slaves. He freed 124. So Martha Custis, Washington's wife, was much richer than he was. She was a widow, and she came into the marriage with several hundred slaves. Washington's will, George Washington's will, only freed his slaves. It stipulated they would be freed after Martha's death, though she frees them in 1801. So here we have Washington, someone who has a complex legacy. Someone who, again, may have had misgivings about slavery, but still believed in slavery, still used the laws to recapture runaway slaves. Though, I guess we could say at least he frees his slaves in his will. So a complex figure with a lot of gray areas. Next up, the case for and against Abraham Lincoln, right? Our 16th president during the Civil War. Now, if you read the 1619 Project or watch a recent HBO documentary on Lincoln, it seems like he's a horrible racist. He's just as bad as, Jefferson Davis or any Confederate leader. And present-day critics point out that he was not an abolitionist and that he held racist beliefs. Right? And there's truth to this, but what about putting his life in context? He's someone who lived in the mid-1800s. Before becoming president, Abraham Lincoln spent one term in the U.S. House of Representatives. And while in Congress in 1847, Lincoln and one of his colleagues drafted a bill that called for the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. We could get in the weeds here. The Constitution gave states control over slaves within their borders, but the District of Columbia was not a state, it still is not. It was under Congress's authority. So Lincoln has this plan to free the slaves in Washington, D.C. Present-day critics say that was too small of an act, but even in 1847, that limited act went nowhere. Right? So had Lincoln said, I want to free all the slaves, it still would have gone nowhere. Lincoln was a pragmatist, he was practical, in many ways he was very moderate. But even this limited bill was dead on arrival. Also, during that one term in Congress, Lincoln also voted to stop the expansion of slavery into the West, into territories gained from Mexico during the Mexican War. Later in 1854, at a speech in Peoria, in response to Stephen A. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act, Lincoln called slavery a monstrous injustice. In this speech, in which Stephen A. Douglas was attending, Lincoln said his first impulse would be to free all slaves and send them to Liberia. Now, I think it's 1821, the U.S. establishes Liberia as a country in Africa for freed slaves, freed American slaves to go to. So present day, this sounds really bad. It's like send them all back to Africa. But in the context of when Lincoln is speaking, some 16,000 former slaves have already left the U.S. and gone to Liberia. But even in this speech, Lincoln comments that that's not quite practical. Right? These slaves know nothing of Africa. Africa knows nothing of them. Lincoln said, quote, if they were all landed there in a day, they would all perish in the next 10 days. And then Lincoln is thinking, what is the alternative? Again, this is a quote. Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? Is it quite certain that this benefits their condition? He asks. He then goes on to say, what next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals. My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we all know that those of the great mass of white people will not. Right, so modern day observers can find a lot in this speech to criticize, but to some extent is Lincoln being honest. Right? Even if I thought all slaves, or the former slaves, would be equal, most white Americans would not. So Lincoln's a pragmatist, he's a moderate, he's tactical. In 1860, as a presidential candidate, Lincoln says in a speech in Cincinnati, quote, slavery is wrong morally and politically. I desire that it should be no further spread in these United States, and I should not object if it should gradually terminate in the whole Union. In this speech, Lincoln is saying that slavery is wrong for what it does to black people. However, because black people could not vote, in his speeches, Lincoln wants to stress how slavery would be wrong and harmful to white people, because he's trying to get white people to vote for him for president. And so Lincoln took pains to stress what whites lost from slavery by advancing the ideology of free labor. Right? White farmers can't compete against slave labor. So again, that is criticized today as not really making that strong of a moral case against slavery. On our left here, the Emancipation Proclamation, September 22nd, 1863. Now, this would not free all the slaves. It's an executive order that would free slaves in states that were still in open rebellion against the U.S. by January 1st, 1863. Now, Lincoln even says the goal here is to punish the Confederacy by depriving them of their labor force. Right? So even though it's celebrated, it is more of a political, practical calculation and not so much of a moral one. Right? Because even by the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves who are in the Union slave states would still be slaves. And so Frederick Douglass, our most famous abolitionist in the 1800s, he was at the dedication of, again, this statue in Washington, D.C. in 1876. Frederick Douglass says Lincoln wasn't perfect. The quote is, taking him for all in all, measuring the tremendous magnitude of the work before him, considering the necessary means to ends, and surveying the end from all the beginning, infinite wisdom has seldom sent any man in the world better fitted for their mission than Abraham Lincoln. So even a longtime critic of Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, found some admirable qualities. A person whose beliefs should be put into context of other beliefs in the 19th century. I have two more figures to talk on. I will try to keep them brief. Another leader whose monuments have faced scrutiny, or at least they're under discussion for removal, is Ulysses S. Grant. General during the Civil War, 18th president. And the excuse most often used in favor of removing Grant's monuments is that he was a slave owner. This is technically true, but let's dig deeper. Grant was a graduate of West Point, an Army veteran who was eventually driven out of the Army because of his own alcoholism. After being basically pushed out of the Army in 1854, he struggled to make a living to support his family. In 1859, Grant's father-in-law, Colonel Franklin Dent, gave Grant a slave named William Jones. Right, so he may have had money problems, but at least he had very wealthy in-laws. So in 1859, Grant's father-in-law gifted him a slave. Now, to solve his own money problems, Grant could have sold William Jones for more than $1,000, over $40,000 in today's money, right? A sum that would have helped him support his family. But instead, after 8 months, Grant freed William Jones. I don't know why it took 8 months, but does this counteract him owning Jones to begin with? Then, of course, later in the Civil War, Grant led Union armies to actually fight against the Confederacy. And later, as president, Grant supported congressional reconstruction, the 15th Amendment, which all you who are in my classes will really come to judge me, gave black men the right to vote. Grant even sent federal troops into the South to protect freedmen from the KKK. Now, if one wants to argue that corruption in Grant's presidency or his policies toward the Plains Indians merit the removal of his monuments, that's another thing. Right? During Grant's presidency, the U.S. fought a number of wars that forced the Plains Indians onto reservations, which amount to ethnic cleansing, if not genocide. Right? So if that's the case you want to make against Grant, go for it. Let's talk about it. On the right, that's the letter written by Grant that frees William Jones. And my last figure, which I didn't even add here, Teddy Roosevelt, another controversial figure with a complicated legacy. As president, he broke up monopolies and established national parks, though he establishes national parks because he really likes to hunt. He also had Booker T. Washington to the White House for lunch and appointed a handful of black men to positions in the federal government. Later in 1912, as the Progressive Party candidate for president, Teddy Roosevelt supported child labor laws, an 8-hour workday, compensation for workplace injuries, and the right to vote for women. But this could be all offset by Roosevelt's role in the Spanish-American War and the construction of the Panama Canal. Roosevelt favored U.S. overseas expansion. He favored the projection of American power, including annexing Hawaii and conquering the Philippines. Right, so another person who has a complicated legacy. Now, this debate over what we learn and how we should teach history, it's not going to go away anytime soon. Historical memory has always been politicized, albeit this politicization has become much more noticeable in recent years. Right? So should we just accept that all leaders are flawed, especially those who are in positions of power, like generals and presidents? Or is this a cop-out? Right? So we have to also think about, should we only focus on the good or the bad? Right? Only the good or only the bad? Or should we acknowledge both the successes and shortcomings when assessing their legacies? And doing so by putting their experiences into context of the time when they lived. All right, and that's it. Thank you all. Okay, better than probably most of my classes. It's only an hour and 5 minutes. Any questions? Yeah, Edward.
I'm wondering about the definition of the critical race theory. I read somewhere that it's quite obscure and complicated and has really very little to do with making people feel bad, as the right wing kind of indicates. Is that something you can elaborate?
Yeah, I think it comes, like initially the concept, I think comes from maybe the 1970s or 1980s. And yeah, it also more recently I've heard, not critical race theory, but culturally responsible teaching. So it seems to be more, maybe not pointing out like every horrible injustice, but it seems to be a little bit more like inclusive of the history of minorities, of non-white groups. So, I mean, that's how I understand it, but it does seem like a kind of a vague concept that's really being kind of latched onto present day.
In other words, they've taken this obscure doctrine and sort of morphed it into something that they can use on a political scale.
I mean, that's what I think. I mean, I would agree with what you're saying. And like I said, back in the 80s and 90s, it was politically correct, right? So there was something against, the way people teach, back then, and so now it's just critical race theory. Yeah.
So it's often said that there are three sides to every story, and that third side is trying to combine maybe the two perspectives. And as a historian, I imagine you probably do this a lot. You try to look at all of the different parties involved and try to give an objective description of what happened without trying to slant it one way or the other. Do you think that that objective view is possible? And if so, how do you balance that with cases like we just covered? In other words, what's your opinion about some of these people, given their good and bad qualities?
Well, the first book I was assigned when I was in grad school for history, it's called That Noble Dream. And that noble dream is objectivity. So basically, it makes the case that there is no such thing as objective teaching, that like we all bring bias in, even if we're trying not to, be subjective. So, true objectivity and like this is the truth of what happened, that's something that we can never get to. So it's people who live through an event, they've got their own motivations, they're witnessing the event, but all primary sources are somewhat skewed because what does the person who's witnessing the event and then talking about it, what's at stake for them, what's their bias. So yeah, true objectivity in like ever knowing like this is the truth of what happened, I don't think that's anything we can ever know.
Therefore, if we're teaching history, we have to accept that every position is going to be biased, and therefore let people decide for themselves? Or do you think there's just no way to teach history if you're going to try to cancel critical race theory? You should cancel all other theories too because there's no way to get at it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like a thankless task, but I mean, yeah, so I realize there's no like objective truth, but I try to be as objective as possible in my classes. And so, yeah, you can only be like, well, this is what this person says, this is what this person says, and the truth is somewhere in the middle. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a hard one to answer. I guess it's a good idea to try to, make the world better by like learning about the mistakes of the past. But, we just keep making the same mistakes regardless. Yeah, it's a cliche, but it's true, that history does repeat itself, right? So whether it's the U.S. going into the Philippines in the 1890s, or the U.S. in Vietnam in the 1960s, or the U.S. in Iraq in the 2000s, they're very similar, but they're different enough, right? So it's maybe I'm just cherry picking that example then, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I don't have an answer for you. Yeah. I guess I would only be in favor of censorship if someone was being like physically harmed. Yeah, I guess on the spot, that's all I could think of. Right, because I try to have open conversations in my classes, but if someone's like very belligerent or, you're stupid, or I'm going to beat you up, or whatever, or they start dropping, racial slurs, then,
So censorship only in times of needed time.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of like the slippery slope argument. I guess, okay, so I said this one time at a meeting, and I was probably, disinvited to the meeting, but it was about this concept, and, I was saying if there's like a Republican group on campus and they want to bring in Ann Coulter, they should be able to do that. Or like I think Beloit College brought in former Vice President Dick Cheney, right? So they should be able to do that, but the other students should be allowed to protest that decision if they want to. So, yeah, I think as long as you're, I guess I would draw the line at like advocating or calling for violence against someone. Yeah. Yeah.
So can you tell me a little more about the 1619 project? Who was behind it? You said the New York Times. And then 1776 project, you said President, ex-President Trump had a hand in it. So I find it really interesting that you have kind of the New York Times, powerful media, and then you have Trump and whoever he kind of enlisted, you have governmental power creating these two projects, okay? So then we have PhDs in history, the experts, correct? Who weren't invited, you know, in great numbers to either kind of help create these projects. So I guess what I'm getting at is how do you, as an expert, a PhD history, kind of teach in a society where you don't have, no one is valued, you don't have power with your expertise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be offensive, I'm just asking how do you kind of navigate that? Because it's either you have press power, whether it's social media or print, or you have governmental, or you have wealth, and no one seems to value knowledge. And so how do you teach in a society to students, to adult students, to a group that doesn't value expertise, but instead values kind of how many hits they get on their blog or who's got so much money.
Yeah.
That's not like a real question.
No, I get what you're saying because it reminds me of like, I had a former student who became Facebook friends with, and I think it was either this past summer or the summer before, during some of like the Black Lives Matter protests, she would post all these things, and it was like, I never learned about this in history class. And I was like, I taught you. You were in my class. So it does seem that there is,
It's not valuing
well, yeah, I guess I would say like getting the likes or getting the shares or, you know, becoming more of just a national figure on Twitter. And so that's why I guess I was really critical of Nicole Hannah-Jones, because just very much like, oh, you disagree with me? Well, then you're a white person. Okay, then you're racist then. You know, so it's just, and the 1619 Project, they have changed some things, and they have said like, oh, we are willing to listen to the historians, but I don't think that's really true. So yeah, I don't know where you teach in that. You know, I would say the 1619 Project is largely better, a lot better than the 1776 report, but that's a very low bar to compare the two. So it's hard. And I wasn't trying to create a false equivalency between them, but you know, as you point out, you've got two groups that, one group did have some historians who wrote some of the pieces, but it's really opinion that is being portrayed as if it's a fact. And then you've got like just like fringe propaganda on the other side. So it's hard. It's difficult, especially because there is so much on social media. And you know, I think, you know, if like my friend in Florida, you know, says something, you know, she didn't want me to use her name because she's afraid of even like, you know, this being recorded could come back to get her, right? And so she was just lucky that she was just happy she didn't get fired, because the university was talking about firing her. The governor apparently wanted her fired. So you are in a situation where it's like, well, I don't want to upset this segment of society because I don't want Twitter coming after me. You know, I don't want to get canceled, but then like I can get canceled from this other side too. So it's hard to really, I mean, I guess the idea is using primary sources and developing critical thinking skills. That's the way to try to navigate through that mess. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I feel like I have all these kind of like vague responses to your really good questions, and so I'm sorry. Yeah.
I have a question from the online audience. Sherry asks, without the knowledge of all the past, how can we not make better choices for the future? Do we not have to understand what took place during Ulysses' time or during this phase to understand? And then the question went away.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think having kind of a greater understanding of these figures before we just say we're going to elevate them, and we're not going to say anything bad about them because they're great, or they did this one thing we don't like, so we're going to remove them. So yeah, just having a kind of a greater understanding and just realizing that everybody makes mistakes, and so that might be a cop-out if it's like, well, you owned like 200 slaves and you didn't free your slaves, right? So, so-and-so makes a mistake by owning hundreds of slaves, I could see how that would be a cop-out. But yeah, the idea is hopefully you delve into the pasts of these people before you really make a judgment. And then you try to put like the values of the time period to make the case. Yeah.
Were there times in the U.S. history where we were less polarized? If we're becoming more polarized now, that indicates a trajectory of less polarization in the past. And is there a causation for that?
I mean, I think there's always been times where there have been divisions. Even if we look back to like the early U.S. with the founding fathers, they did not get along with each other, and a lot of them really hated each other. So there was even divisions then, and that led to our two-party system. There have been times where this polarization has gone away, after like a big, after the U.S. gets attacked, whether it's Pearl Harbor or 9/11. But I do think the polarization is worse, and I think the internet, social media is making it worse. Because yeah, well, yeah, I don't want to say too much, but there was a point where, yeah, I don't know. I was going to say something like, there was a time when people might get elected for an office and I wasn't afraid. It was like, oh, this person's reasonable, and even if I don't believe in their, even though I disagree with a lot of what they say, I still think they're an upstanding person for the most part, and maybe they're going to line their pockets, but most of them do. But now it's just like, instead of like, oh, this person seems okay, and this person, but I agree, my opinions are more aligned with this person. Now it's more just like you're voting for the person who's just not going to like destroy the country, So I don't know where I was going with that tangent, but yeah, I think we were really divided right before the Civil War, and we were still divided on and off afterwards. But we have periods where the U.S. does come together when usually there's like some sort of outlet. But I do think in the past, decade or so, maybe since the early 2000s, I think we have become a little more polarized, and I think the media plays a role, political parties play a role, sure, but I think social media, the internet plays a big role. Oh, yeah. Brad.
Continuation of banning these books, right, especially recent news texts. Are we just kind of like doomed to have this historical false narrative, removing parts of history as if it didn't exist? My understanding of removing these from public schools that's not being taught. Are we just left to, I guess, teach our own kids, like, hey, this actually happened, or what do we do next?
Yeah, and a lot of books have been banned, but a lot of them, it's more about literature. And so I only had like the 2 history-related books up there. But yeah, I mean, maybe it's just on parents to like teach their children things that aren't being taught in schools, especially, you know, and I'm from the South, but I want to say this, the South, a lot of the southern states, there's more of the banning there. But yeah, so I don't know if it's, you know, really the role of parents or, you know, other kind of adults in the lives of children to pick up the slack for where schools leave off. Yeah.
So, you're very politicized in our view of history now, and you pointed out, you know, some very old cultures that also politicize their historical stories. Are there any countries, or have there been any time periods that have done this well, that have done it right? Do we have any models to look at of cultures or practices, current or past, where they made some ground in avoiding politicizing?
Well, I think really anytime you have maybe even public schooling, like I'm thinking like public schooling developing in the 1800s at the time nationalism is developing. And so whether you're in France or Britain or Japan or the US or wherever, a way to kind of push that nationalism is through, and patriotism and all this other, you know, propaganda is through the school system. So a time when memory and the studying of the past hasn't been politicized, you know, that'd be a hard call. Because you know, we've probably also heard the cliche, what is it, like the winners write the history, you know, or something along those lines. But that kind of falls into this as well. So history being used to glorify one group and at the expense of another. So yeah, I don't know if there's a you know, a time or a country that has been like as apolitical as possible when it comes to, you know, telling their story.
Not even Russia?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. Well, I mean, I could, you know, Russia in the 1800s, their first universities, you know, there was secret police on campus, really controlling what people learned, preventing students from like leaving and going to like France or Germany or England. And then, of course, you know, during the communist period, a lot of censorship, and today too, I'm sure, under Putin. All right, well, I did promise some classes I would be done by 7:30, so I think this is a good time. All right, thank you all for coming.